So Ioanna is a Greek visual artist and researcher. Her work investigates the relationship between collective cultural memory and fiction, drawing emphasis on photographic object, processes and encounter. She explores the boundaries of a primitive yet futuristic vision of places and people. She is a graduate of journalism with an MA in photography from the Royal College of Art in London and an MA in cultural studies. Now, Ioanna is not unfamiliar with this space. So she is the recipient of many awards, including the Royal Photographic Society Bursary Award in 2018, and she was the winner of a Sony World Photography Award in 2020. 2020, that's right, isn't it? Yeah, I'm getting my dates mixed up. So yeah, looking forward to hearing your talk. There'll be 5 minutes at the end for any questions. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you so much for showing up for the last talk of the day. So yeah, indeed, the last time I was actually in this room was in 2018 during the Pop Festival. I was speaking about my former photographic exploration, The Truth is in the Soil, which was a 5-year project after the death of my father, with my return back home in Greece and the exploration of ancient rituals around death. Indeed, at the very early stages of this work, I was supported by the Royal Photographic Society, which was a great encouragement for kind of really departing onto this personal journey, which changed along the way, and that's why I, in a way, mentioned this project, because it's been foundational to my practice. It ended up being my book in 2022 with London-based publisher Ghost Books. And if any of you have set eyes on a copy of the book, you would see that towards the end of it, I had already begun working with archives, and more specifically the archive of my father, which was partially discovered by me after his death and was given in its entirety later on to me by my mother. And strangely enough, actually, a small fragment from one of his records, which covers a period of time of his life as a sailor and later on marine engineer, came to illustrate the cover of the book. So somehow, I mean, today I'll be speaking about pearls. Obviously, it's part of the title, Archives and Disasters. And I personally see this project, which is still ongoing, as a kind of afterlife of The Truth in the Soil. It is primarily, I would say, an exploration of the ocean as an archive of both material and symbolic spaces, and really ideas around how we witness and reimagine through the archive, how we play with different types of temporalities and untold personal and collective histories. The personal I already touched upon, but it specifically focuses on a secret that was found through the archive of my father, which was another family from his past that I did not know about. And I came across it for the first time through his images. In dialogue with a series of archives around histories of loss of Australian pearling disasters, where I'm currently locating and I'm carrying out my practice-led PhD overseas, which I will be speaking about the kind of synchronicities between these different archives shortly. But I would like to say that my interest, I guess, into kind of departing from this very personal discovery within the archive and kind of activating my own personal history in relation to wider histories around the loss and the kind of representations through the archive, departed also from my relocation once I had discovered what was within my father's archive overseas, and this kind of really urgency to connect with this new territory from Australia, 9,000 miles away from home. And I departed from this idea of the periphery of this entire inquiry, which has been the ocean, you know, as an element and as a force in terms of like encompassing this new land to me, but also detaching me from my other home back in Greece, where a big part of the work kind of refers to and echoes these different relationships to the archive. And I would say that from these very early images, which are both photographic and also mixed media images, and I'll be speaking more about my creative processes shortly, we see that the ocean is not just a source of life, but it's also a place of death. And indeed, I'll be speaking about part of the tragedies that have happened beneath its surface. but also ideas around how, you know, the representation of the ocean in terms of its infiniteness and vastness, it's kind of triggers ideas around, you know, creative representation and the human exploitation of these ideas. And in these works, it has been a kind of relationship between proximity and distance, and I would say the infinite and the intimate within these works, and ideas around the ambiguous and the unknown, which hasn't been encountered only through the idea of the ocean, but it has been passed on in the kind of relationship, to my experience at least, in terms of working with the archive. This idea of a limitless material which is constantly kind of reformed across all of its dimensions. Having begun to work with my father's archive, I did realize that at no moment I could see the entire picture of it, but I was revisiting it in fragments and in intervals. And this has been a quite interesting kind of personal journey through this material as well, which has advanced when I began working with historical archives later on, in terms of how somehow personal history is not a fixed reality, but it's a kind of constant process of meaning making. And I think part of these works and the way I've been working with photography, archives, collage and embroidery in my practice, and here we see some earlier kind of installations, departs from this idea of how somehow working with fragments and in fragments allows one to kind of trace the origin of these archival kind of objects and draw on and create new narratives. Indeed, I mean, as many of you know or might be working with collage or being interested in the medium is a composite art, so it does begin with images that had already had a life. And throughout the creative process, as well as the research process, one could ask to whom or towards what they belong. Together with embroidery, I would say that even in the early stages, at the early stages of my practice, is a kind of versatile form that through subversions and stitches and erasures in different forms, it has allowed me to kind of partly recover and partly fictionalize these new narratives within my work. To my experience also, on the one hand, working in this fragmentary manner is suggestive of all the kind of historical silences and gaps and omissions within those archives, but at the same time it becomes a kind of possibility to draw on and create new narratives. This is a material that is really characterized by its own multiplicity in terms of how it could be worked on in terms of perception or in terms of like creative research and practice. And from the very early stages of this work, I did realize that this kind of inquiry wouldn't be developed through a single trajectory, but it would go through multiple ways. And indeed, as I already mentioned, this kind of narrative happens between two places, what I call kind of like my primitive home, which a big part of my practice has always referred to and has been photographed back home in Greece, where my own history kind of departs from, my own maritime heritage comes from, and where the archive of my father was found on this Greek island depicted here, to this kind of other home, my living house, away from home, having brought the archive of my father in that new place, and how it kind of, again, kind of divorces me from ideas that I had been working on, but allows me to connect with new ones and draw upon those new narratives and contextualize further my creative practice. Obviously, for me, this has been, it has been, and it is, it's an ongoing project. It's been quite a process, and I think there's a lot of complexity in the narrative behind it. And I did ask myself at the very early stages how this, complex narrative space could come together and be explainable and functionable, and what would be the kind of universal vocabulary of space in terms of objects and structures that could allow me to do that. Having asked those questions, I thought really about the places I inhabit within my practice, but also my interest within the archive and how the one potentially was echoing the other, or sometimes was even its reverse. Here we just see some views of things that I have been looking into. And I was specifically looking for something that was somehow non-linear, but at the same time continuous, and was also reflecting this idea of ambiguity within this whole process. So the kind of symbol of the spiral and the idea of going in circles kind of came forward as a very strong one while going through this first phase of the research. And I did realize that, there's this idea of the concentric circles, but then they do connect through twists and through turns. And there's this idea of a repetition and the multiple within this figure. Eventually the title of the work is Seven Circuits of a Pearl, which the way the work came together was with those two words, through circuits and through pearls. Today I'll be speaking to you about circuit 1 to 3 of this labyrinthine structure, as eventually through my research the 7-circuit Greek labyrinth came to become this kind of morphology of this entire inquiry, really encompassing the topology of the different places I have been looking into and how those kind of interconnect to the lands that I've been photographing. As I said, we're going to be moving in the periphery of this labyrinthine structure and kind of wandering through its discontinuous encounters, as the very center of it is where I'm planning on going next. And how did it all begin with actually circuit 1, which I have named the Mother of Pearl, which I will be explaining more about shortly. It did begin with this woman with the pearl necklace on this side of the slide, my father's ex-wife Ioanna, that I came to encounter for the first time through his archive. But it begins the other side of the slide with an image actually of my father and paying attention in the arrangements of objects and textures in one of the boats he was working on. Finding out, zooming in obviously into a very blurred figure of a woman that I later on found the originally framed image within the archive. Obviously there are different synchronicities within these stories as for this story to come together, and that's why I've been speaking about the fragments. I have been speaking to my family as well, and especially my mother, and I have been kind of recovering the parts of the story that I hadn't been aware of. So having come across this, I began working on my PhD, which originally was focusing on archives and ideas around the loss and function and memory. And while I relocated to Australia almost 2.5 years ago, this idea of the pearl necklace, which there are many multiplicities of Anna within my father's archive with it, came to become somehow the shiny detail that provided new context for the next connection of the next circuit, as I did realize that I was in a part of the world where the early pearling industry was a huge chapter of Australia's history. Indeed, around 1910 to 1915, Broome in the west north of Australia was the pearling capital of the world. So it started becoming more and more interesting to me in terms of how I was drawing from my own maritime history and then kind of coming to this other much larger island, but locating myself really on the western coast and started really looking into the coastal life of Australia and the kind of histories and practices and geographies of the ocean around centuries. And then it did begin, it's not about similarities, but I would say it's more about synchronicities and dialogue between the type of materials that I had been looking into. It did begin with this idea of the in and out, just like the views in my father's archives from boats that he has been photographed on, or images he has photographed the ocean from. And I eventually started looking into Western Australian Shipwrecks Museum's archives, which brought me into contact with an entire history of pearling and many different aspects of it. So pearling had been happening for centuries in that part of the world, but it hasn't been, just briefly to say, an industry that it was only about the men in white, the pearling masters, pioneers and maritime explorers, but it was also a very dark history involving indigenous people as divers for pearls, many lost lives due to tropical cyclones, ideas around wealth, secrecy, power, empire, and where the archive as a space positioned itself in relation to these new territories. Having had those questions in mind, I began kind of moving forward from the idea of the woman with the pearl necklace and the maritime exploration of those two places to the circuit 2, which I call the pearling disaster. And it did begin by attempting to focus on one aspect of what I showed as a kind of summary of the things that I had been looking through those archives. And I mean, to a certain extent, we never look at one singular thing, but we look at the relation between things, and our somehow our vision and our way of seeing is continuously forming and kind of activating new information. And I started paying attention to the part that I have highlighted, which is really the northwest, the Dampier Peninsula of Australia, where the biggest part of the pearling activity had been taking place. And I did realize the numbers that you see are all the records, and many that haven't been recorded, of shipwrecks that have taken place, more than 1,600 shipwrecks just in that part of Australia, which finally brought me into looking into shipwreck reports and ruins from that part of the coast, and coming across the pearling liger named Anne, which kind of became the new dialogue between Anna, the woman with the pearl necklace at the bottom of my father's archive, and Anne, this historical ruin that I have been writing about throughout my PhD, the kind of pearling liger lost at the bottom of the ocean in this other part of the world. And obviously, I mean, my practice attempts to also somehow speak about this complexity of spaces within spaces. It's a kind of interrelational space of different narratives coming together from an investigative to a more esoteric resolution. And there's this idea of the floating presence of the unknown within those mixed media works. But I would like to just say a bit about how the pearl is not just a name, or the pearl necklace, or how pearls have been sought and bought and stolen to end up through empire around a woman's neck. But I've been also looking quite a lot around how the pearl has formulated so many different ideas within my practice, and has really activated, to me, extraordinary ways of using such a small thing at first and kind of expanding upon what it can become. So I won't have the time to go a lot into detail, but I mean, the pearl is the only aquatic gem that is developed within a living organism, the oyster. It's very interesting how the pearl is formed. It's formed through the intrusion of a very small foreign organism that could be a parasite or a grain of sand. And it activates this process by entering the oyster of a response, which is the triggering this process of the mother of pearl, which is named the nacre. And this shelling material starts in concentric circles to kind of encompass this organism that has entered the shell, and eventually it forms the pearl. So in the center of the pearl, there's always this intruder. Obviously, ideas that I don't want to become too literal about, but ideas around how I've been intruding into my father's archive, how there's the idea of concealment, and what's manifested through those archives, just like the idea of the oyster, as well as ideas of ruinous potentially discovery, which speaks of this idea of this small disaster happening for the creation of the pearl within the oyster. But also, interestingly, when looking at other images of pearls, and here is underlined microscopy, we see that the mother of pearl is not formed in a continuous manner, but is formed in a rougher way, in a kind of finger-like printed patterns that do remind of the idea of the labyrinth and this idea of the cross-section of the paths that I've been attempting to speak about. Here we see the Pictada maxima, which is mainly the type of oyster I have been looking into, being part of the Indo-Pacific. It's the largest pearls developed in the world. And eventually, coming back to the practice, I think this idea of one narrative within another has been also part of the making. I began later on working with silk and freshwater pearls and pearl beads, and really the idea of the folding of one material onto another, the idea of manually stitching on those textiles, creating a lot larger artworks than I ever had in terms of unique artworks, has been really attempting to reflect these ideas of how this inquiry has been really, like diving deep inside the ocean, is really moving from the dialectics of the large to the smaller, and then the relationship between what's always concealed and kind of revealed throughout those processes. And eventually, while moving towards the last part of my presentation, I would say that using those different processes that include archival art, photographs, material, pearls, it creates a complex creative space as well that somehow requires the viewer either to insert himself completely within this narrative or somehow observe it from the other. So I've been somehow becoming part of this narrative in so many ways, but at the same time, I think I've been so much distanced from the places that I have been looking into, and I think those works dive into those archives, but then they visit the places that are outside the archive, and what is the type of language that brings those two together. So eventually the last part of my presentation is not the most recent one, but is the one that has been developing while all this other work with the archive has been made, is the one actually that is part of the exhibition. So this idea with engaging with a sort of kind of like metaphorical darkness, but also the dark aspect of the pearling history, kind of led to a lot of landscape work that has been made on those same places where the archive kind of refers to. And the engagement with this kind of physical darkness by photographing at night within those territories of the Australian outback came slowly to come in dialogue with the stories that I had been kind of exploring through the archives. Stories about what was called, for instance, here is just one example of it, blackbirding. Big part of the pearling industry was really indeed focused on slavery of Aboriginal people being kidnapped and being forced to die for pearls. Other artworks, they are more subtle in the ways I approach certain sort of ideas around the mollusk and the oyster. Here we have a representation of blister pearls and ideas around Asian mythology and the celestial luminary of pursuit of wisdom through the pearl. But if you notice on the bottom of the image, we have fragments of Japanese letters. Again, very big part of the work echoing places I photographed and I've seen through the archive of the big importance of the most well-reputed divers up in Broome, who were Japanese. More than 900 graves in the cemetery of the city of Broome of those people exist. Here we see part of the historical image. And then again, coming back to how, by enlarging the scope of this kind of photographic inquiry, has allowed me to make the connections between the ocean that I began kind of speaking about and the land, and the kind of histories that are intertwined in multiple ways, kind of in and around the Dampier Peninsula that I have been looking. So it has allowed me to start bringing those images together and see how, by having made work about kind of research the ocean, how I began going more and more in the interior of Australia, and what were the type of relationships of this idea of the crossing until the very center of this inquiry. What are the type of conversations that could be raised through that? Circuitry is what I've been working on right now. This has been, in a way, an expansive exercise, also mapping and moving through this idea of the visible and the invisible territories of one's practice and different histories. And eventually it came to become very solid when I did realize, by researching more about how the Dampier Peninsula somehow meets the coastline of the Indian Ocean, but also becomes the meeting point with the Great Sandy Desert, which I will be showing it just a bit more inland. The first ever Australian evidence of pearls was actually found not in the ocean as one would expect, but in the desert, 22,000 years ago, in a rock shelter. And actually this map shows all this movement of shells, because they were also used by Aboriginal people during rainmaking ceremonies in the desert, and we see one of them here. And it kind of allowed me to start creating this dialogue about how so big part of the work had been researched around the ideas of the ocean, but was relating to those territories of the desert in more than one ways. I mean, indeed, Australia, 70% of Australia is clustered as arid or waterless, which makes it the second driest continent in the world after Antarctica. There's no way to travel across Australia from west to east or north to south without encountering the desert. So I won't be going into detail into this, but looking into how the desert has, in very early representations of it, become this very unforgiving place of what the early explorers of Australia named the hideous blank, or what made them name Australia later on, the terra nullius, belonging to nobody. How Australia through Western art has been seen as a place where the big disaster happens in the desert. Here, Sydney Norton depicts Brooks and Wills that they got lost in the final act of man removing his clothes just before the final act of madness in the desert. So the desert, in a way, has always been seen as this kind of featureless land with no toponyms, no way but this red dirt of Australia that leads to nowhere, which has been challenged and obviously changed throughout the years. But it's interesting to see different perspectives of also how many people see the desert as a place of no man's land, but at the same time, through Aboriginal art, we do see the desert as its own map, its own unique map of kind of temporal complexity of different species, with the spirals kind of really showing the water holes, the different, obviously, wildlife living there. And I just mentioned those, just to end up with a few of my images, by having obviously kind of, I don't know if I would call those references, but having looked into ideas of the desert while I have spent so much time photographing it, I would say it's a culturally diverse and creatively stimulating place, most possibly one that I never had in my practice. Is a place that has played a key role in how I unfold this new part of the project, where ideas around monoliths at night and trees and declivities and water holes and clay pans have kind of allowed me to create this conversation between the submarine and the subterranean in my practice. So I'm just showing some of the works of a frilled lizard that I have photographed and have then integrated freshwater pearls on its collar, on its neck, and I have embroidered through its entire program of the indigenous animal. Here we see another conversation between ideas developed. It's one of the textiles I saw in the beginning, and one of the images that is also shown here in the exhibition of the monolith. And I think we'll end with one of the images that is also shown upstairs, really looking around the ideas of light and this idea of the different light, how somehow the desert erases perhaps boundaries, and the night, kind of allow us to creatively synthesize new spaces in the practice because we don't quite see. I think this entire process of this work, it is an exercise of attempting to see something and say something about those discoveries in the archive and in the landscape. And in a way, the pearl also is this idea of the refracted and reflected light, which is, I would say, always ambiguous throughout this process. So I will leave you with this thought, and I'm happy to hear any questions if you have.